It says in the order of service that the poem is by Janet Lowry, but it's not because I changed it. And it's now by Sharon Olds, and it's called The Connoisseur of Slugs. When I was a connoisseur of slugs, I would part the ivy leaves and look for the naked jelly of those gold bodies. Translucent strangers glistening along stones slowly, their gelatinous bodies at my mercy. Made mostly of water, they would shrivel to nothing if they were sprinkled with salt. But I was not interested in that. What I liked was to draw aside the ivy and breathe in the odor of the wall, and stand there in silence until the slug forgot I was there, and sent its antenna up out of its head, the glimmering umber horns rising like telescopes, until finally the sensitive knobs would pop out the ends, delicate and intimate. In this poem, two things seem to be true. One is that slugs live in forgotten, dank, clammy places, and they leave trails of goo wherever they go. When I think of sensuality or what is sacred, I don't think about slugs, but Sharon Olds does. She finds rapture in watching the grace and beauty of the slug, the naked jelly of those gold bodies. I think Olds is trying to explain to us that slime can glisten. It can be evidence of life. Olds is telling us the whole story rather than letting us rest on what we've been told about slugs. I took this poem with me this summer when I was working as a chaplain at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, because it reminds me to keep my eyes fully open to see as much of the whole truth as possible. My supervisor assigned me to work with Rikers Island inmates and patients on the closed psych ward and people who are suffering addiction problems. Those also known as the slugs of our society. And I wanted to remind myself that these people glisten despite the slime of their stigma, because they're human. And of course, it can be as dangerous to glorify somebody as it can be to dehumanize them. But no one fits the binaries that society prescribes us. People are not only good or only bad, as we're taught in elementary school and by a lot of our media sources. I learned the lesson of the inherent worth and dignity of all people in this fellowship. I attended religious education in those rooms, and I learned to ask questions and to have faith. And it's here that I found the inspiration to go into ministry. So this morning I wanted to use this sermon to share with you most recently where I am on that journey. As I said, I worked as a chaplain at Bellevue Hospital this summer. Everyone who's pursuing ministry in seminary has to do what's called clinical pastoral education. Some choose to work with hospice or in a prison or with a hospital. But I chose to work at Bellevue because you get a little bit of everything. It's an interesting place. It's a public hospital, so it's like Grady in Atlanta if you're familiar. There are signs up everywhere saying, "We don't care about your immigration status, we care about your health." And I often had to find a translator when I was speaking with Polish or Korean or Egyptian patients, which happened more than you would think. According to my supervisor, Bellevue has the highest volume of any emergency room in the country. It's also New York City's leading trauma hospital. But if you've heard of it up to now, you know that it's most famous for its psych ward. It's always in old movies where the woman who's gone mad is dragged away, or the criminal goes. There's also an entire floor that's a prison unit dedicated to housing Rikers Island prisoners who are suffering physical or mental illness. So what scared me most about clinical pastoral education is that working in an emergency room or a prison is supposed to prepare us for parish ministry. It's daunting. I don't think that's true. I hope not. But what I found under these disorienting circumstances is that what is true about a person, what they're like, what's true about being a good chaplain, what's true about human nature and the meaning of existence is not singular. I and most humans I know like to imagine that what is true is straightforward and streamlined. There is an ultimate truth rather than many truths in conversation. But as Unitarian Universalists, we are more familiar with this concept of many truths in conversation, since we don't claim to be the sole keepers of revelation or divine wisdom or any cosmic answer. But somehow this idea doesn't easily permeate my daily life. I want something to be true and its opposite to not be true. If there is one simple truth, maybe I could throw myself into it completely, living passionately by one rule alone. One law that can decipher all of existence. In a hospital setting especially, I longed for a truth like this, as I'm sure many of you have. But instead I found that truth only got more complex. One of my favorite patients that I worked with was a Vietnam veteran on the psych ward who had been addicted to heroin, and he repeatedly was in Bellevue trying to get into their methadone clinic to wean himself off of heroin, and we'll call him Rick. Rick's cheeks sagged in like a melon baller had taken out some crucial parts of his skeleton, and he was so thin that his legs couldn't support his own weight, so we spent our time together. He was in a wheelchair. Over a 3-week period, I got to know Rick a little bit. After Vietnam, he'd been in and out of prison and addiction. He'd fallen in love with a Dominican woman and got clean. They'd moved in together and actually had a few kids. And for a long time, Rick stayed clean and helped raise those kids. But inevitably, he started using heroin again and used all of his family's resources in the process. By the time I'd met Rick, understandably, the woman he loved and his kids had kicked him out of their lives. Rick had been in prison for assault and battery, robbery. He'd hurt a lot of people. But he was wise and kind, too. He had read the Bible start to finish many times, which is not easy. And he'd found insights into its stories more than I had studying it at the graduate school level. He was trying to write a book about his time in Vietnam, the friends he'd lost at 19 years old, the lessons he said he'd learned about politics and the evils of racism, and the importance of falling in love. Part of my chaplaincy training was to have clinics, what we called clinics, where you sit with your colleagues, the other seminarians, and you try to remember as much as possible about a conversation you've just had with a patient. Write it down, present it to the group, and everyone can say, "He said that," or "That was good, it seemed to open him up," whatever. When I shared a conversation I had with Rick, my supervisor immediately said, "He is taking you for a ride. He wants you to feel sorry for him and believe he's a good person." that's true. Because if you don't have boundaries in chaplaincy, you end up pitying someone and cushioning their guilt or regret in a way that can deny it or keep it from running its course toward repentance. You don't want to enable unhealthy or cruel behavior. You don't want to imply that addiction is okay. And Rick probably was putting me on in some ways. I knew he wanted to continue using heroin, and I knew he wanted to stop. It was true that Rick loved his children, and it was also true that he lost the privilege of being in their lives. Rick wanted me to feel sorry for him, to let him off the hook somehow. But what is also true is that Rick was terribly lonely. His body was deteriorating, and his mind was full of a lifetime of violence. I started thinking that these seemingly incoherent truths can be painful to behold, but they're not contradictions. They're the whole story. And we rarely hear the whole story about a human life because we so badly want someone to have been a good person or a bad person, a success or a failure. But as Unitarian Universalists, if we are going to believe in the inherent worth and dignity of all people with spiritual integrity, we had better take in the full story of the human condition. And that is not a shallow or an easy belief to have. The other chaplains in my program were Catholic, Lutheran, Evangelical, Christian, Episcopalian, Jewish. And I was often teased both affectionately and dismissively by this group. Because Unitarian Universalists seem known to all seminarians as the butt of all religious jokes. The religion that isn't really a religion, people who don't have to know what they believe, and my recent favorite, the gateway drug to atheism. My colleagues were always pushing me to answer them. What is it that Unitarian Universalists hold to be true? In the midst of cancer's indifference or the human capacity for cruelty, what did I believe to be true about our nature and the meaning of existence? What do we UUs find that we can live by? Each of my colleagues relied in different ways on a singular, solid, and infallible truth, something that got them through late nights in the emergency room and the intensive care unit. And I did find myself wondering, is life a tragedy with moments of comic relief? Or is life a comedy, something joyous and good with moments of terror and sadness? Ideally, UUs hold all the complexities that live between these extremes that are created in an attempt to make truth seem singular. We open our ears and hearts because each one of us falls somewhere between good and bad, male and female, gay and straight, blind faith and all-consuming doubt. We are individuals, but we come alive in community, in a conversation of truths. There were two quotes on the wall in the chaplain break room that I held close as I was trying to discern how I, as a Unitarian Universalist, what I believed about the existence and the nature of human beings in the face of extremes. The first one is from Leonard Cohen. Everything has a crack in it. That's how the light gets in. And my new favorite is by Eric Heller, who said, "Be careful how you see the world. It is like that." When it was time for our final self-evaluation We had to share our personal theology based in our religious tradition. What I've found to be true for me so far about human nature and the meaning of existence has a lot to do with the philosophy I learned here. The worldview that many things are true at once. All of us have cracks for different reasons, but the light is pouring in, giving us the courage to see the whole truth of human life in existence and to be in awe. And I believe that in the never-ending cycle of extremes, it is always compassion that overcomes hatred, healing that follows grief, and the good of humanity always overcomes its evil and not the other way around. This is the message I hear in the 7 principles, and is what I was taught is the way UUs see the world, as a place of hope and possibility, and therefore, it is like that. We believe that life is a comedy in which senselessness and loss play roles. Unitarian Universalism teaches us to stand where all rivers converge, where what is bleak and what is blissful and all things in between stream through our consciousness and tell us the truth in different ways. Blessed be.